grim darkness of the far future, the Imperium of man stands as a fragile beacon of hope in a galaxy consumed by war. Beneath the towering spires of the Administratum and the endless, grinding battles of the Astra Militarum lies a far less seen yet equally crucial force, the Adeptus Arbites. These enforcers of the Emperor's law patrol the underbelly of the Imperium, enforcing a rigid, unyielding order that reflects the iron fist of the Imperium itself. Yet, behind the helmeted facades and unwavering duty lies a world filled with secrets, struggles, and sacrifices that few will ever know. The Arbites are not just the law's hand. They are the shadows that follow, the enforcers of justice in a world where justice often seems like a fading illusion. But what happens when the enforcers themselves fall prey to the very system they uphold? Before we dive deeper into this tale of law, order, and the dark truths of the Adeptus Arbites, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Help us unravel more of the grim, dark mysteries of the Warhammer 40K universe. And now, let's embark on this journey, uncovering the untold lives of the Arbites. The city below was a maze of towering spires, a testament to the Imperium's dominance, a place where every stone, every corner, every whisper carried the weight of law. The streets buzzed with the ceaseless movement of the masses, a flurry of life that mirrored the order the Adeptus Arbites fought to uphold. At the heart of this vast, bustling metropolis, under the shadow of the Administratum, the Arbites stood, uncompromising, unflinching. They were the Emperor's hand made manifest, the force that ensured the galaxy remained bound by the harsh threads of law and order. With every step, the Arbites could feel the weight of their purpose. Their boots echoed through the empty halls of the Manufactorum, their visors reflecting the dim light of distant forges. The stench of promethium mixed with the acrid odor of sweat, and the faint hum of machinery filled the air. This was the world they protected, the lifeblood of the Imperium itself. It was an existence grounded in discipline, in unwavering duty, and in sacrifice. But even here, in the heart of Imperial power, shadows crept. The Arbites knew better than anyone that law wasn't simply a set of rules to be enforced. It was a weapon, one that could be twisted and wielded by those in power. To the citizens, the Arbites were a symbol of hope, of justice, an unmovable force of authority that ensured the survival of the Imperium. Yet, as their heavy boots resonated through the concrete, the Arbites were also keenly aware of something few ever saw: the irony of their existence. They stood not as guardians of justice, but as enforcers of a system that had long since ceased to be about true fairness. The world around them, one of corruption, injustice, and strife, needed them to maintain the illusion of order. The Arbites were a barrier, not to chaos, but to the bitter truth that order itself could be just as dangerous. Inside the cold, metallic walls of their fortress-like barracks, they trained, hour after hour, day after day. There was no room for weakness. Their existence was a cycle of preparation, execution, and the constant battle against the very forces they sought to subdue. In this city, they were the protectors, the judges, the executioners. Their faith in the Emperor and the Imperium was absolute, but the whispers in the dark, the murmurs in the corners of their minds, never fully ceased. Theirs was not a life of personal glory or recognition. It was a life lived in service, one where their very identity was consumed by their role as enforcers. Still, they were not invincible. Even the Arbites were not immune to the pull of doubt, to the gnawing fear that perhaps, just perhaps, their work was in vain. They had seen the corruption, the inefficiency, the rot that festered within the upper echelons of the Imperium. But none of this mattered. Their duty was not to ask questions, but to enforce the will of the Emperor. They could not afford to entertain thoughts of rebellion, of doubt. Their existence was defined by a singular truth. The Emperor's law was absolute, but even the most rigid structure could break. The law, once a beacon of certainty, now felt like a chain, one that tightened with every passing day. The enforcers of that law began to feel the pressure, the weight of knowing that what they were protecting might not be as noble as they had once believed. They stood at the precipice, one step away from understanding the darker truths that lay beneath the surface. And yet, in their hearts, they knew that their existence was intertwined with the Imperium. If they faltered, even for a moment, the entire galaxy would fall into chaos. So, they endured. They fought, they enforced, and they kept the balance, no matter the cost. The streets below, the factories, the palaces, all depended on the Arbites to hold it all together, to keep the very fabric of Imperial society from unraveling. And so they marched on, step by unyielding step, beneath the shadow of the Emperor, ever vigilant, ever steadfast. For in the end, the law would always find a way to assert itself, whether it was right or wrong. The harsh, rhythmic pounding of boots on metal floors echoed down the narrow corridors of the Arbites' barracks, where enforcers drilled in perfect formation, their movements as sharp and precise as the blade of an executioner's axe. In the wake of their training, the smell of sweat and the clang of weaponry filled the air, familiar sounds of routine. Yet, no matter how many times they repeated the motions, there was an unspoken truth that lingered in the silence that followed their exercises. The Arbites were more than just soldiers. They were living symbols of order. The faceless enforcers, clad in their distinctive power armor and featureless helmets, had become the embodiment of the Emperor's absolute will. But it wasn't just the physical weight of their armor that burdened them. The mental toll was far greater. The Arbites spent their lives maintaining a sense of justice, yet the very law they upheld seemed to have lost its moral compass. Every day they witnessed the stark contrast between the power of the Imperial elites and the broken masses they protected. Every street they patrolled, every city they secured, was a reminder that the Emperor's rule had come at the cost of countless lives. The Arbites could no longer deny the contradictions they faced. How could they defend a system where the very people they protected were crushed underfoot by the weight of Imperial bureaucracy? In the vault-like offices of the Arbites' headquarters, the leaders of the enforcers gathered to discuss the latest edicts from the highest echelons of the administratum. In these meetings, there was no room for questioning. The orders were delivered coldly, without mercy or explanation. But behind the iron-fisted commands, there were unspoken tensions, fractures in the once unshakable unity. The Arbites had been created to serve, to enforce the law without hesitation. Yet, as the years dragged on, cracks began to appear in their rigid structure. The voices of dissent, though muted, began to emerge. Some questioned the morality of their work, while others simply wondered, were they truly making a difference? The constant, unrelenting weight of duty had begun to erode the resolve of even the most seasoned Arbites. In the dead of night, when the city slept and the neon lights flickered like distant stars, some would gather in the shadows of their barracks, quietly sharing their thoughts, their doubts. They had seen the horrors of war, of heresy, of countless atrocities committed in the name of order. They had stood watch over the desperate, the downtrodden, and the broken. But despite all they had witnessed, they could not escape the truth. They had become mere cogs in a machine that cared little for their lives or their sacrifice. And yet, they had no choice but to continue. They had no choice but to uphold the law, no matter how twisted it had become. The consequences of failure were too great. A single lapse in their vigilance, a single moment of weakness, and the Imperium would collapse into anarchy. The Arbites knew this better than anyone. Their very existence depended on their unwavering commitment to the Emperor's law, no matter the cost. But the cost was beginning to weigh heavily on them. In their hearts, they could feel the churning emptiness that came. With knowing they had become the instruments of a system that had long since abandoned its original purpose. The Emperor's law, once a beacon of hope, had become a tool for the powerful to further their own agendas, while the oppressed were left to suffer in silence. The law, once a symbol of justice, had turned into a weapon wielded by those in power to keep the masses in line. The Arbites had become pawns in a game they never signed up to play. They had pledged their lives to serve, to protect the Imperium. But now they found themselves wondering, was this the life they had sworn to protect? As they stood on the edge of the city, looking out over the smog-choked skyline, they felt the weight of the Imperium's sins bearing down on them. The Arbites had been created to protect the Emperor's vision of order, but now, more than ever, they were beginning to question what that order truly meant. Could they continue to serve a system that demanded so much, but offered so little in return? The city stretched out before them like a living organism, its veins and arteries pulsing with the constant flow of humanity, the hum of machinery, the rise and fall of voices. The Arbites stood at its heart, the ever-watchful guardians of the law. Yet even in the stillness of the night, when the city seemed to rest, their thoughts never truly found peace. They were always vigilant, always waiting for the next crisis, the next betrayal of the Emperor's will. The streets below them seemed endless, filled with the bitter taste of survival. The city's heartbeat echoed in their ears, a reminder that they were part of something much larger, something far more complex than any individual could comprehend. Their duty was a solitary one, yet they were never alone. Around them, the other enforcers moved like shadows, ever present, ever vigilant. There was no room for personal lives, for friendships, for anything other than the mission. The Arbites were not soldiers in the conventional sense. They were the Emperor's hand, an instrument of order in a universe perpetually on the brink of chaos. Their faces were hidden behind the cold, expressionless helmets, and their voices were drowned by the roar of the city. To the civilians they protected, they were faceless enforcers, symbols of unyielding justice. To the criminals they pursued, they were the harbingers of doom. The Arbites were both feared and revered, their reputation as steadfast servants of the Emperor preceding them wherever they went. But as the years wore on, the weight of their responsibility began to take its toll. The Arbites had seen everything, the depths of human depravity, the crushing forces of war, the hollow victories that came at the cost of innocent lives. Yet, they had never faltered. They had never questioned the righteousness of their cause. Until now. There was a growing unease among the ranks, whispers in the barracks, quiet conversations in the dark corners of their headquarters. Some began to wonder whether their unshakable loyalty to the Imperium was truly worth the sacrifices they had made. Had they become too blind to the corruption that festered beneath the surface? Had their dedication to the Emperor's law become a justification for the horrors they had witnessed? It was a question few dared to ask aloud. The answer, though, was there, lurking in the shadows, just beyond their reach. They could feel it, creeping through the cracks in their training, in the very foundation of their beliefs. The law they had sworn to uphold was not a pure force for good. It was a tool, a weapon wielded by those in power to maintain their grip on the Imperium. The Arbites were not the righteous defenders of the innocent. They were the enforcers of a system that cared little for the lives of those it crushed beneath its heel. And yet, no matter how much they questioned, no matter how much they doubted, they could not walk away. The Imperium depended on them. The Emperor's will could not be ignored, not even by those who had glimpsed the truth behind the mask of law. To abandon their duty was to abandon everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed. So they carried on. They continued to patrol the streets, to uphold the Emperor's law, to do what they had always done. But the cracks in their resolve grew wider with each passing day. The Emperor's law was absolute, yes. But was it just? As they stood together on the cold metal rooftop, gazing out at the sprawling city, below, they realized that the real question was no longer whether they could uphold the law. It was whether they could continue to do so with their souls intact. The moon hung high above, casting its pale light over the city below. A silent observer to the endless march of humanity, ever moving, ever struggling. For the Arbites, the city was both their prison and their charge, a place where they held the fragile threads of law, maintaining balance in a place where chaos could erupt at any moment. It was their duty to uphold the law, to enforce order. But with each passing day, the distance between what they believed they were protecting and what they actually were began to grow. As the nights stretched on, the Arbites could feel the unease creeping in. It wasn't just the whispers between the ranks or the subtle disillusionment in the faces of their comrades. It was something deeper, something more insidious. It was the realization that their lives had become a series of motions, a scripted routine, where each action was dictated by the law they were sworn to serve, not by any sense of personal righteousness or belief. They were cogs in a machine that ground on, indifferent to their personal sacrifices, to their moral quandaries. They had been raised on stories of the Emperor's justice, of a divine order that would bring prosperity to all under his rule. But the truth of their lives, of the lives they witnessed, felt nothing like the grand vision they had been promised. The world around them, from the crumbling underbelly of the hive cities to the pristine, gleaming spires of the administratum, was not a reflection of divine order. It was a distortion, a warped version of the Emperor's ideals. Power, wealth, and influence were hoarded by the few, while the many suffered in silence, their cries unheard by the very system that was supposed to protect them. The Arbites, for all their vigilance, were only part of the system. They were the Iron Fist, the enforcers of a rule that kept the masses in line. But they were also blind to the deeper rot that pervaded the Imperium. They had seen it all: worlds torn apart by war, innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of Imperial expansion, and whole populations condemned to live in squalor, while the powerful lived in their fortified palaces. They had witnessed the abuse of power, the manipulation of the law for personal gain, and the unyielding brutality of the Imperial machinery. And yet, despite all of it, they had stayed true to their mission. They were the Emperor's hand, and to falter was to abandon the Imperium itself. But as they stood in the darkness, listening to the distant rumble of the city, the weight of their duty felt like an unbearable burden. The realization began to sink in. The law they served, the law they enforced, was not a perfect system. It was a system built on lies, on power, and on the suppression of those who dared to question it. The Arbites had become the tools of a system that had long since abandoned its original purpose: protecting the weak, defending the innocent. They had become the enforcers of an empire that had grown complacent in its own power, indifferent to the suffering it caused. For the first time, the Arbites began to question everything. What were they truly protecting? Was the Emperor's will truly just, or was it merely a means to keep the status quo intact? The thoughts were dangerous, unspoken. No Arbites officer dared voice them aloud. To even consider such questions was a betrayal of their duty. Yet, in the deepest corners of their minds, the doubt festered. A sudden shout broke the silence. A figure emerged from the shadows, a fellow enforcer, a brother in arms, his face hidden behind his helmet, but his posture betraying the strain of the years. He was weary, and his movements were slower than before, as though the weight of the world had finally begun to bend him. The Arbites officer approached him, a silent understanding passing between them. They had both seen too much, endured too many horrors, and yet they had never allowed themselves to falter. But tonight, something was different. The world, the law, the Emperor's will, it all felt uncertain, like a fragile structure built on sand. They could no longer pretend that everything they fought for was pure. They had seen the truth. The law was a weapon, and they were the ones wielding it. The thought was unbearable, yet undeniable. The officer, his voice barely a whisper beneath his helmet, spoke, the words carrying the weight of years of unspoken doubt. What if we're wrong? What if we've been serving the wrong cause all along? The words hung in the air, heavy and pregnant with meaning. For a moment, there was only silence. Silent acknowledgement of the unspoken truth that had been gnawing at their souls for so long. The Arbites had upheld the law, but the law had betrayed them. They had been loyal to a system that had used them, twisted their beliefs, and left them hollow. As the officer walked away into the shadows, the Arbites stood there, unmoving, their gaze fixed on the vast, sprawling city below. The law, once a beacon of hope, had become their prison. The Emperor's will, once their guiding light, now seemed distant, lost in the darkness. They had a choice to make: continue the fight for a law they no longer believed in, or walk away from everything they had known, everything they had fought for. And for the first time, the choice seemed uncertain. The city never truly slept. Its pulse never faded, always thrumming with life beneath the surface, even in the darkest hours of the night. But for the Arbites, the dead of night was when the weight of their duty felt heaviest. The patrols, the arrests, the constant vigilance. These were all part of the unspoken oath they had sworn. Yet beneath the cold, polished armor and the stoic faces lay lives filled with secrets, stories, and scars no one outside the Adeptus Arbites would ever see. It was in the moments of solitude, when the day's work had been done and the halls of the barracks were quiet, that the enforcers allowed themselves a fleeting moment of vulnerability. They would gather in small groups, their voices low, their words often broken by the unspeakable truth that hung in the air. No one outside these walls would understand. No one could know what they had witnessed, what they had become. The law was an unfeeling thing, an unyielding force that demanded sacrifices. And some sacrifices were greater than others. The Arbites' service was more than a matter of duty. It was a surrender. Each enforcer had traded a piece of themselves, buried a part of their humanity beneath the cold metal of their armor. The family they had once hoped to build, the relationships they had once dreamed of, all of it was lost in the void between duty and personal desire. For some, it was a slow erosion, the creeping realization that they had become something other than human. For others, the loss was swift, like a knife to the heart, severing all ties to the world they once knew. The secret lives of the Arbites were often marked by these unspoken sacrifices. They had seen the worst of humanity, cults of chaos, rogue psychers, traitors to the Emperor. And yet, it was the little things that haunted them. The faces of the innocent victims, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies broken and discarded like refuse. The moments when the law demanded actions that left them questioning their own morality. It wasn't always the grand battles or the heretical uprisings that scarred them. It was the quiet moments, the personal tragedies, the small betrayals that carved deep into their souls. One such moment lingered in the mind of enforcer Jacek. He had been a loyal servant of the Emperor for nearly 2 decades, a warrior of unflinching resolve. His hands were stained with the blood of countless criminals and heretics, and yet he could still recall the face of the child who had died on his watch, her tiny form crumpled in an alleyway, a victim of a brutal gang. She had been nothing more than an innocent, yet the Arbites had been forced to carry out their orders, no matter the consequences. The law demanded her death be avenged, and so it was. But what had become of that justice? Was the law truly serving the greater good, or had it become a tool for vengeance? Jacek couldn't help but wonder, as he sat alone in the dim light of his quarters, the weight of his helmet heavy in his hands. The child's face, frozen in terror, haunted his every waking moment. He had enforced the law, but at what cost? Across the room, Sergeant Corin sat at his desk, a data slate flickering with the latest reports from the field. He never spoke of it, but his gaze always wandered to the far corner of the room, where the weapons lay, polished and ready for the next engagement. He had long since abandoned any hope of a life outside the Arbites. His thoughts were consumed by duty, by the never-ending mission to protect the Imperium. But even Corin had his demons. He had witnessed the corruption that festered within the halls of power, the abuses committed by the very men who issued the orders. He had seen the way the system chewed up the lives of those who served it, casting them aside when their usefulness had expired. It was a system that demanded loyalty, but offered no loyalty in return. There were days when Corin felt like he was suffocating under the weight of it all, the unending cycle of violence, the hollow victories, the lives lost for causes that seemed increasingly meaningless. But what could he do? To question the Emperor's law was to question the very foundation of the Imperium itself. To do so would mean betrayal. So he kept his doubts buried, tucked away in the dark corners of his mind, where they couldn't hurt him. And yet, even as they carried out their grim duties, even as they silenced the whispers of rebellion within their hearts, the Arbites could not escape the reality of their lives. They were not just enforcers of law, they were its prisoners. The law they upheld had become their cage. It bound them to a world where the innocent suffered, where the guilty were often left untouched, and where the very system they had sworn to protect was rotten to its core. But the Arbites could never truly escape. There was no room for hesitation, no room for questioning. The law was absolute. The Emperor's will was unyielding. Theirs was a life of service, of sacrifice, of silence. To speak the truth was to break the unspoken pact they had made with the Imperium. And so they carried on, their hearts heavy with secrets, their minds burdened with the weight of what they had seen. As they stood together in the barracks, side by side, the silence between them was deafening. It was the silence of those who had seen too much, who had lost too much, and yet had nothing left but the law to hold on to. The following day broke as it always did, gray, cold, and heavy with the weight of the city's existence. The Arbites moved like shadows through the streets, their armor reflecting the dim glow of the neon lights that flickered in the smog-filled air. To the common citizens, they were the embodiment of the Emperor's justice, a living wall between the chaos of the underworld and the fragile peace that clung to the city. But to those who served, there was no illusion. They had seen what lay beneath the surface, what the Imperium demanded, and they could no longer pretend that their duty was as pure as the Emperor's name. For Jacek, each step was a reminder of the life he had given up. He could hear the voices of his family in his memory, the soft laughter of his daughter, the warmth of his wife's embrace. But those voices were fading, becoming a distant echo. He had traded his humanity for duty, and as the years dragged on, the sacrifice had become harder to bear. There were no warm embraces in the barracks, no smiles or laughter. The Arbites were solitary figures, bound by their oath, isolated by their service. They were meant to be impervious to the world around them, untouched by the suffering they enforced. But Jacek knew better. He had seen the toll this life had taken on his fellow enforcers, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, their minds frayed by the constant barrage of brutality they encountered. It was during moments like these, when the city seemed to suffocate under its own weight, that the truth would find its way into Jacek's thoughts. What did it all mean? Was this the Emperor's will? Was he truly serving the Imperium, or was he merely feeding into a system that had long outlived its purpose? The law, he had come to realize, was not the shield he had once believed it to be. It was the sword, the blade that cut through everything, from the innocent to the guilty, from the righteous to the corrupt. And in the end, it was the Arbites who wielded it. His reverie was broken by the sharp command of Sergeant Corin, his voice a reminder of the unyielding structure that governed their every move. Jacek, focus, we have a job to do. It wasn't a reprimand. It was simply an acknowledgement of the duty that must be carried out, no matter the cost. Corin had long since surrendered to the demands of the Imperium, burying his doubts in the depths of his soul. There was no other way. To question was to risk everything. And yet, even as they moved deeper into the heart of the city, their armor clanking with each step, a part of Jacek could not let go of the truth that had settled in his chest. The Arbites were not heroes. They were not saviors. They were the instruments of a broken system, a system that had lost its way long ago. They were not protectors. They were enforcers of a law that had become a weapon, used by the powerful to maintain control, to suppress dissent, to keep the masses in line. As they reached their destination, a decrepit building in the heart of the lower hive, a place where the desperate and the damned clung to life like rats in the dark, the weight of it all hit Jacek once more. The law demanded justice, but justice had no place in a world where the powerful preyed upon the weak. The Arbites were sent here to restore order, to quell the uprising of a local gang that had crossed the line. The reports were clear. They had taken hostages, and they were preparing for a violent confrontation. Jacek could hear the sounds of distant screams, the cries of those who would be caught in the crossfire of a conflict they did not understand. It was always the innocent who suffered the most. And yet, the law demanded action. The Emperor's justice demanded that the Arbites do what they had been trained to do. No hesitation, no mercy. As they moved into position, Jacek's mind drifted back to the secrets buried deep within him, the truth that he could never speak, the truth that the law, the very system they fought to protect, was corrupt. It had become a tool of the powerful, a weapon to crush those who dared to challenge it. The Arbites, for all their noble intentions, had become the enforcers of that system. And as they stormed the building, guns raised and ready to execute the Emperor's justice, Jacek couldn't help but wonder if they were truly serving the Emperor or serving the will of something far darker. With a sudden command from Corin, they breached the door, the sound of gunfire echoing through the narrow corridors. The battle was swift, brutal, and one-sided. The gang members, poor, desperate, and outgunned, fell quickly under the weight of the Arbites' firepower. The hostages were freed, but the cost was high. The city's streets would be stained with blood once more, and the Arbites would walk away, their duty fulfilled. But in their hearts, they carried the same weight, the burden of a law that demanded sacrifice, the burden of a duty that demanded they ignore the human cost. As the last of the gang members fell, Jacek stood silently, his helmet casting a shadow over the scene. The mission was over. The law had been served. But at what cost? The question lingered in his mind, unanswered, as he turned and walked away, the weight of his armor pressing down on him, heavier than ever before. The barracks were quieter that night, the eerie stillness a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left behind. The city outside continued its ceaseless hum, but inside the Arbites' walls, there was a strange sense of isolation that no amount of camaraderie could dispel. Jacek sat alone in his small quarters, the weight of his helmet resting on the table before him. His fingers, stained with the blood of the fallen, trembled slightly as he ran them over the edges of the helmet, tracing the indentations that had been carved over years of service. The surface was scratched, worn, just like the man who wore it. The mission had been simple: strike fast, strike hard, and restore order. But it had left a bitter taste in his mouth. The screams of the hostages, their wide eyes, desperate and pleading, echoed in his mind, even in the quiet solitude of the barracks. They had been saved, yes. But at what cost? The gang members, the ones who had held them hostage, had been dealt swift justice. But the lives lost in the crossfire were too many to ignore. The city was a place of constant war, where survival meant taking sides, and sometimes those sides weren't so clear. Jacek had long since stopped asking himself whether he was the good guy. Goodness had no place in the grim, dark world of the Imperium. The law was all that mattered, and the Arbites were the ones who had to enforce it, no matter the moral ambiguities that came with the job. He had once believed in the righteousness of his cause, in the purity of the Emperor's will. But now, the Emperor's will seemed distant, almost impossible to grasp. The law they upheld was no longer a tool for justice. It was a tool for control. It was used to keep the status quo, to protect the powerful, to suppress the weak. And the Arbites, for all their sacrifice, had become the enforcers of that system, the ones who carried out orders without questioning them, even when the cost of those orders was so high. There was no room for hesitation, no room for doubt. They followed their commands, did their duty, and kept the peace. But at what cost to their souls? Jacek leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing as he tried to push the questions from his mind. But they lingered, persistent as ever, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He had been in this position before, faced with the unbearable weight of his choices. Every mission was the same, an unyielding march forward, carrying the law with them like a shackle. The truth was simple. The Arbites were nothing more than instruments of a broken system. He reached for the data slate on his desk, the flickering screen casting a faint glow in the otherwise dark room. The latest reports, the usual cases, the usual crimes. Nothing new, nothing that would surprise him. But as he scrolled through the entries, one report caught his eye. An investigation into corruption within the local administratum. It was a common occurrence, of course, but something about this one felt different. The names listed were high-ranking officials, people with connections to the very institutions they were meant to protect, people who could never be touched by the law they had helped create. Jacek stared at the names on the screen, a sinking feeling in his chest. He had seen this kind of thing before. Corruption at the highest levels, hidden behind the facade of imperial bureaucracy. The Arbites were meant to uphold the law, but the law they upheld was always in favor of the powerful. The Emperor's name was invoked, but it was never his will that was carried out. It was the will of those who had the power to bend the law to their advantage. He couldn't ignore it. Not this time. The corruption had gone too deep. He had seen enough to know that the system was broken. He had always been taught to follow orders, to uphold the law without question. But the law had been corrupted by those in power. The very system they had sworn to protect had become the very thing they had once fought against. Jacek's hand hovered over the data slate, his heart racing. He knew what would happen if he pursued this investigation. The Arbites were not meant to question the system. They were meant to enforce it. Going against the flow would mean betraying everything he had ever known. It would mean walking a path that no Arbites officer had ever walked before. The path of defiance, of questioning authority, of challenging the very foundation of the Imperium. But as he sat in the dim light, alone with his thoughts, Jacek knew he could no longer turn a blind eye. The truth was out there, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and corruption. The Arbites were not the protectors of the Emperor's will. They were the enforcers of a system that had lost its way. And Jacek, for all his doubts, couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He stood, his chair scraping against the cold floor, and walked toward the door. There was no turning back now. The secrets they carried, the truths they buried deep inside, could no longer stay hidden. The Arbites had been complicit in upholding a system that had forgotten its true purpose. It was time for change. It was time to face the darkness. The Arbites were the unsung heroes of the Imperium, a force that stood silently between the innocent and the chaos that threatened to engulf them. They were the Emperor's watchful eye in the midst of an ever-growing tide of corruption, a presence so deeply entrenched in the heart of Imperial society that most citizens knew only of their name, never their true role. In the shadow of the Adeptus Astartes, whose glory and power were celebrated across the galaxy, the Arbites were little more than a footnote. And yet, without them, the Imperium would have crumbled into anarchy long ago. Jacek knew this truth better than most. He had served faithfully for decades, his life marked by the grim, unending work of maintaining order in a galaxy that seemed beyond salvation. And yet, despite their crucial role, the Arbites were little more than tools to be wielded by the powerful. Their existence little more than an afterthought in the grand machinations of the Imperium. While the Astartes were revered, worshipped as demigods, the Arbites were forgotten. They were the ones who fought on the ground, who waded through the filth and blood of the underhives, while the Imperium's elite sat in their high citadels, untouched by the struggles of the common man. But no one saw the toll it took. No one saw the sleepless nights, the moments when the weight of the law crushed everything in its path. They saw only the badge, the armor, the power that came with the position, but never the human cost. The Arbites were not celebrated. They were not honored. They were simply there, always present, always enforcing, always alone in their vigilance. Jacek had long since stopped expecting recognition for the work he did. He had given up the hope of a life outside the Arbites, a life with family, with love, with peace. His commitment to the Emperor was unshakable, but it came with a price. The law demanded his all, and in return, it offered nothing but emptiness. The Arbites had no future. Their existence was an eternal present, a never-ending cycle of service, one mission after the next, each more brutal than the last. But as the years wore on, Jacek began to wonder if they were truly making a difference. What was the point of all this sacrifice, if it only served to prop up a corrupt system? He had seen the way the powerful manipulated the law, how the wealthy and the influential bent the rules to suit their needs, while the poor and the downtrodden were crushed underfoot. The Arbites were nothing more than pawns in a game that had no winner. They had no purpose beyond enforcing a broken system, and yet they continued. Day after day, mission after mission, they stood between the lawless and the innocent, even as they themselves began to feel the cracks in the foundation of the very system they protected. They were the forgotten soldiers, the ones who kept the Imperium from descending into total chaos. Yet, they were never recognized for their sacrifice. Their names were never spoken in praise. They were simply the law made flesh, the Emperor's will incarnate. And when their duty was done, they were discarded, left to fade into the shadows. Jacek had often wondered why he kept going, why he continued to serve, to fight. He had no answers, only the relentless pull of duty, the knowledge that the law demanded his service, no matter the cost. He had seen the best of the Imperium, the noble warriors of the Astartes, the brilliant minds of the Adeptus Mechanicus. But he knew the truth. The true strength of the Imperium lay not in its warriors or its scholars, but in the silent enforcers who kept it all together, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart. And yet, even as he carried out his duty, a part of him longed for something more. A part of him longed for the simple pleasures of life, a family, a home, a future. But those were luxuries he could never have. He had given up his life for the Imperium, and in return, the Imperium had given him nothing. The Arbites were the forgotten soldiers, and there was no glory in being forgotten. But as Jacek stood in the darkened alleyways of the Hive City, his helmet gleaming under the pale light of the street lamps, he knew one thing for certain. He could never stop. Not while the Imperium needed him. The law needed him. And in a world as broken as this, that was enough. The Arbites were forgotten, yes, but they were also the last line of defense against a galaxy consumed by war, by chaos, by death. Without them, there would be nothing left but the void. As Jacek's boots echoed through the empty streets, he realized that this was the price of duty. The Arbites were forgotten, but they were necessary. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The Imperium would continue, whether it honored their sacrifice or not. The law would continue, whether it was just or not. And the Arbites, the forgotten soldiers, would continue their watch, silent, unseen, but ever present. The patrols never ended. They were relentless, a constant beat that filled every hour of every day. The Arbites moved through the labyrinthine streets of the Underhive, their helmets scanning the crowds for even the slightest hint of lawlessness. To the citizens of the lower city, the Arbites were both a curse and a shield. They were the ones who kept the chaos at bay, yet they were also the ones who punished every misstep, every breach of the law. They were the enforcers, but also the silent judges, handing down verdicts with a word, a glance, or a gesture. Jacek had long since learned to tune out the noise of the city around him, the cries of desperation, the mutterings of the damned, the endless thrumming of the machines that kept the Imperium running. The noise had become white noise, a backdrop to the mission at hand. He focused only on the task in front of him, the mission that had been assigned to him and his fellow enforcers. The rest of the world, its struggles, its stories, had no place in their lives. There was no room for personal attachment in the life of an Arbites officer. Duty was their only constant, their only purpose. And in a universe so vast, so unforgiving, they were the last line of defense against the chaos that threatened to swallow everything. But as the days wore on, the questions continued to gnaw at Jacek. What was it all for? He had spent so many years enforcing the law, upholding the Emperor's will. But what was the result? The cities were still filled with crime, with corruption, with suffering. The same faces he had seen years ago were still there, begging in the streets, selling their souls for scraps, trapped in the cycles of poverty and violence. Nothing had changed. The law had not saved them. The Arbites had not saved them. They had simply enforced a system that allowed the powerful to thrive, while the weak were crushed beneath the weight of Imperial rule. Jacek couldn't help but wonder, was he part of the problem? Was he perpetuating the very system he had sworn to protect? The thought was a dangerous one, a thought that could unravel everything he had built his life upon. But it was a thought that wouldn't go away. He had seen enough to know that the Imperium, for all its grand ideals and promises of unity, was broken. The law was no longer a beacon of justice. It was a tool for the powerful to maintain their grip on power. And the Arbites, for all their sacrifice, had become nothing more than instruments of that control. He had seen the corruption firsthand. The high-ranking officials, the ones who issued the orders, the ones who sat in their fortified offices while the people starved in the streets, they were the ones who had corrupted the system. They had twisted the law to suit their needs, to maintain their own power. And the Arbites, they had become pawns in their game. Jacek knew that the Arbites had once been something noble, something pure. But somewhere along the way, they had lost their way. They had become the enforcers of a system that cared nothing for the people it was meant to protect. And yet, Jacek knew that he could never walk away. The law was all he had ever known. The Emperor's will was his guiding light, the one constant in a galaxy full of darkness. If he turned away from the law, if he abandoned his duty, what was left? The chaos would return. The streets would run red with blood. The Imperium would crumble. It was a harsh reality, but it was the only reality Jacek knew. There was no escape from it. As they moved deeper into the underhive, Jacek's thoughts returned to the faces he had seen over the years. The faces of the innocent, the broken, the lost. They were the ones who suffered the most, the ones who paid the price for the failings of a system they had no power to change. And the Arbites? They were just another part of that system, another layer of control that kept the people in line. Jacek had once believed in the purity of his duty. He had believed that the law was just, that it protected the innocent and punished the guilty. But now, with every passing day, the lines between right and wrong seemed to blur more and more. In the distance, a flare of light broke through the darkness, signaling the end of the patrol. Another mission completed, another night's work done. But the satisfaction that once came with their victories, the knowledge that they had kept the peace, that they had upheld the law, was gone. Jacek no longer felt the sense of accomplishment he once had. The victories felt hollow, like fleeting moments in a never-ending cycle of violence and suppression. As the Arbites retreated back to their barracks, Jacek couldn't help but wonder if there was more to their existence than this. He had given up everything for the law, for the Emperor's will. But now, in the quiet moments before sleep claimed him, he asked himself, was it enough? Was the sacrifice worth it? The answers, as always, were elusive. But deep down, Jacek knew that he would continue, just as he always had. He had no other choice. He was an Arbites, bound to the law, to duty, to the Emperor's will. No matter how broken the system had become, no matter how deep the corruption ran, he would continue to serve. The Arbites were forgotten soldiers. Yes, but they were the last line of defense against a universe that cared nothing for order. And that, in the end, was enough. The precinct fortress breathed like a slumbering beast, its walls alive with the thrum of generators and the low chant of a shrine servitor reciting litanies to steady the machine spirits. Jacek stepped through the sanctum gate as the incense hit the back of his throat, bitter, resinous, clinging to the inside of his helmet like a taste he couldn't wash away. He signed the Aquila by habit and handed his combat shotgun to the rack's mag clamps. feeling the sudden lightness in his arms as if something essential had been taken with it. The auto-quills along the intake desk scratched without pause, rendering the day into lines, columns, and guiltless ink. Law made tidy, blood made legible. Sergeant Corin found him before he could disappear into the barracks. The man's Vox grill rasped with recycled air, his posture set to the angle Jacek had come to recognize as warning. "Proctor wants the after-action, now." There was no time to clean armor, no time to scrape the soot of blasted plaster from his greaves. They walked the corridor in silence, past a cyber mastiff dozing with one red eye open, past a chastener chapel where iron tools gleamed beneath votive candles. The door to the proctor's hab chamber irised open with a clank, and the smell of consecrated oil rolled out like a tide. Proctor Livius didn't speak at first. He simply turned a data slate in his gauntlet and let the glow fall across Jacek's faceplate. Column after column of sanction codes, authorizations, and transit seals scrolled past, too pristine to be true. Livius tapped a single line with a gloved finger. Edict of entry was escalated by an administratum liaison, Lex Mechanic Voren, 2 cycles old. The gang's dossier was red-flagged for special handling. His gaze sharpened. "Your report notes civilian collateral beyond tolerance. You will amend the phrasing." Jacek kept his voice steady. "The hostiles used bodies as cover. We neutralized as mandated." The words tasted like metal shavings. "You will amend," Livius repeated, then leaned back. "And you will stand down from any follow-on inquiry. The liaison has closed the book." The law had spoken with another's tongue. Jacek inclined his helm and signed acknowledgement, because that was what the badge required. Corin's hand tightened once at his elbow, a pressure that meant live to fight the next order and nothing more. But as the door sealed behind them, a clerk detached herself from the scriptorium alcove and drifted in their wake like a moth riding drafts. She wore administratum gray, so faded it had become the color of ash, and her augmetic eye clicked as it focused and refocused, nervy, quick. "Arbitrator," she said without ceremony, voice flat as paper. "You dropped this." He hadn't, but he took the thin data chit she palmed against his gauntlet. Her name was stamped on her badge in tiny, crowded letters. Marla Ayande, sub-prefect of freight tithes. She was already walking away when he slid the chit beneath the lip of his bracer. Corin saw the motion and said nothing, a silence that spread like a stain. He viewed the contents in a maintenance cubby where the walls sweated condensation and the hum of the vent masked whispers. Freight abstracts, reroute orders, a manufacturum's output diverted from bonded depots into a private void berth owned by a minor noble charter, names connected by seal, seal connected by favor, favor armored in law. The raid's gang had been skimming from shipments that should never have existed in the first place. Jacek scrolled until the characters blurred, and the same word kept surfacing like a corpse. Exemption. The law had wrapped itself around the rot to keep its shape. The Vox on his collar spat abrupt staccato. "Unit 7 to sub-level Tertia, officer down." The words burned the air clean. Jacek was moving before he thought, Corin's stride snapping into place beside his. Lifts were jammed, so they went by service stairs, down past heat that tasted of promethium and old copper, the city's breath turning thicker with every landing. At Tertia, the corridor lights cycled in a sick rhythm, and the Auspex rune over the bulkhead door pulsed a sluggish green, like a heartbeat going wrong. They They found them in a corrugated warehouse that smelled of damp rags and machine grease. 2 Arbites lay under black tarps that didn't quite hide the hard lines of their carapace. A cyber mastiff stalked in a tight oval, claws ticking, vox sniff twitching at blood. A junior arbitrator briefed in a voice too fast. Ambush, crossfire from the mezzanine, off-world stubbers, autoguns. Jacek knelt and eased a tarp back an inch, shot pattern on the chest plate like a constellation he had charted too often. He angled the light, counting the splayed edges of the impact. A familiar spread, familiar burn. The mastiff's vox sniff whined once. Jacek quieted it with a knuckle against the jaw grill and felt the vibration travel into his bones. He rubbed a fleck of residue between forefinger and thumb. It crumbled with an oily drag. Munitions signature aligned too closely with Arbite's issue rounds to be chance. He let the tarp fall and stood with his mouth dry. The mezzanine was an ugly tangle of wire and patch plates, but the angles were clear. Whoever had pulled the triggers had known where the armor's seams would give. Corin's voice was almost gentle. "Say nothing here." "Internal?" Jacek asked, too low for the recorder servitor drifting near the door. "Or a mirror of us made to fit the shadows," Corin said. "Either way, your words belong to the report and nowhere else." A chastener arrived in a flurry of sanctified leather and quiet amusement, all needle-thin instruments and prayers, engraved so fine they looked like hairline cracks. He took a sample from the plate and tasted the air like a priest deciding if incense pleased the shrine's spirit. "All things will be rendered to law," he murmured, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. Jacek watched the case seal itself while the truth was smothered under stamps. They signed the forms with auto-quills that squealed a little on the cheap synth parchment, and the crime scene folded into procedure. Back in the stairwell, the city's breath pressed close, warm with decay. Corin halted at a landing streaked with machine oil fingerprints and looked at Jacek the way a man looks at a friend about to step into a place where friendship is contraband. "I know that look," he said. "Put it away." Jacek should have. He should have let the day's dead become numbers that would be tabulated and marched into the archive vault. Instead, he found himself in a storage nave behind the precinct's chapel, where stacks of confiscated banners leaned like tired soldiers, and the air carried the waxy weight of old candles. Marla was waiting there with her hands folded so tightly the knuckles gleamed. She didn't ask for oaths. She only spoke names and dates in a clipped litany, each one a step down a staircase built beneath the courthouse. "You file wrong, and the forms devour you," she said, eye flicking as though the walls themselves were auditors. "You file right, and you vanish slower." She nodded to the chit. "Cross-check berths 17 through 19, with the last 3 edicts of emergency levy. You'll see the gap where law makes room for theft." He wanted to ask why she was risking herself. Instead, he asked the thing that mattered. "Who benefits?" "Those who can afford not to be named," she said. "Those who can make the Arbites file their own defeat as closure." The vox on his collar clicked twice in the particular rhythm of a private line. No ident tag, no source. Just a whisper shaped into static that carried like a quiet blade. "Arbitrator Jacek, quiet chapel, come alone. The proctor marshal would speak before the record wakes." Corin's shadow filled the knave's mouth a second later. He hadn't heard the call. He didn't need to. "If you go," he said, not unkindly. Go as if you have never learned to hope." Jacek closed his hand around the chit until the edges bit through glove and skin. The precinct's heart thudded around him. The generators, the shrine servitor, the tired city beyond the walls, every pulse in time with his own. Somewhere, a bell struck the hour, and the sound sifted down like ash. He turned toward the quiet chapel, where candles burned low, and the law pretended it could pray. The quiet chapel sat at the heart of the precinct fortress, nestled between rows of data slates and maintenance decks that hummed with the droning monotony of routine. The faint scent of incense clung to the stone walls, mingling with the sterile scent of polished chrome and the distant echo of machinery. In its silence, the chapel felt like a place forgotten by time, a place where the weight of the Imperium could be felt, but never truly understood. Jacek stepped through the chapel's heavy doors, the soft click of the mechanism drowned out by the quiet murmurs of prayer from the few enforcers who still sought solace in this place. The chapel was old, ancient even, and its walls were lined with relics from a time when the Emperor's justice had been pure, before it had been tainted by the harsh realities of the galaxy. Now, the Arbites, once the stalwart defenders of the Emperor's law, stood on the precipice of something darker, something unknown. In the center of the chapel, beneath the golden aquila that adorned the ceiling, stood Proctor Marshal Dalvian. The man's broad shoulders were stooped with the weight of command, but his gaze was unwavering, cold like the steel of the Emperor's sword. Dalvian was a man of few words, but those few words were often laced with authority that could bend the wills of the strongest minds. He had seen the rise and fall of countless Arbites officers, and now, it seemed, he was facing the fall of the Arbites themselves. "You came," Dalvian said, his voice low but cutting. He turned slowly to face Jacek, his eyes sharp, assessing. "I wasn't sure you would." Jacek said nothing, only nodded as he stepped further into the chapel. The words that had been lingering in his mind, those questions he had been carrying for so long, hung in the air between them. The Proctor Marshal had sent for him. That alone spoke volumes. Jacek had no illusions about his position within the Arbites. He was a tool, no more, no less. And if Dalvian wanted him to listen, to understand, it meant something had shifted, something had broken. "Do you know what it is to be an Arbites, Jacek?" Dalvian asked, his tone almost a whisper now, as if he were speaking to himself rather than to his subordinate. To stand between the law and the people, to be the iron fist that crushes the helpless, to be the face of a system that never sees the faces of those it destroys. Jacek's mind raced as the words landed like blows. It wasn't just the job, the duty, the endless cycle of patrols and reports. It was the deep, gnawing realization that they had become nothing more than instruments of the Emperor's bureaucracy. They were the arm of a system that had long since abandoned its nobler ideals. The law was supposed to protect, but what did it protect, if it only served to maintain the status quo of the powerful? Dalvian turned back toward the altar, his fingers brushing the edge of the sacred relics that adorned the stone. "We were the Emperor's chosen. Once," he continued, his voice tinged with bitterness, "we were supposed to bring justice, but now, what are we? A tool for the administratum, a tool for the houses, a tool for those who hold power. We were supposed to be the guardians of the law, but we've become the enforcers of tyranny." Jacek felt a shiver run down his spine as he took in the Proctor Marshal's words. The truth was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the truth nonetheless. The Arbites, in their unyielding commitment to the law, had become complicit in a system that had lost its way. The Emperor's will had been twisted into a tool for the powerful, used to suppress the very people the Arbites had once sworn to protect, and they had become pawns in that game, just as Jacek had feared. "I didn't come here for answers," Jacek said, his voice strained. "I came because you summoned me." Dalvian turned his cold eyes on him again, this time with an unsettling intensity. "And yet you came, because you knew what I would say. You knew that the Arbites cannot continue the way we are. We have become broken, Jacek. We have become the very thing we were meant to destroy." Jacek swallowed hard. The words felt like the final thread unraveling in a long, twisted tale. The Arbites had always been about duty, about order, about unwavering loyalty to the Emperor. But the truth was clear now. There was no place for them in a system that had grown so corrupted, so far from the ideals it had once stood for. The law was no longer a guiding force for justice. It was a weapon wielded by the few to control the many. "You don't have to do this," Jacek said quietly, though even he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Dalvian or to himself. "We could walk away. We could abandon this, let the Imperium burn itself to the ground." Dalvian's face softened for a moment, but his eyes remained hard as ever. "You think that's an option?" he asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "If we walk away, what happens then? The Imperium collapses. The people are left to the whims of warlords and criminals. There is no escaping this." Jacek's mind reeled with the weight of it. There was no escape. There was no rebellion. There was only duty. And the price of that duty was more than he could bear. "We've been chasing shadows," Dalvian said, his voice quieter now. "But the truth is that we are the shadow. We've always been the shadow." The Proctor Marshal stepped toward Jacek, his gaze steady and unyielding. "The Arbites were never meant to be heroes, Jacek. We were always meant to be the tools of order. But now, order is a lie, and we are the ones who keep it standing." Jacek stood frozen, the weight of Dalvian's words pressing down on him like 1,000 tons of stone. The law they had served, the system they had upheld, had fallen apart, and they were the ones who had held it together, no matter the cost. "We must decide," Dalvian said, turning to face the altar once more. "What we protect, what we serve, the Emperor's law, or the truth we've kept buried." Jacek looked at the silent walls of the chapel, feeling the crushing weight of his oath, of the life he had given to the Emperor's service. He had never questioned before. But now, as Dalvian's words echoed in his mind, the truth was clear. The Arbites were broken, and they had been for a long time. And so were the men who served them. The air in the quiet chapel was thick with incense and unresolved tension. Jacek stood motionless, his feet rooted to the cold stone floor as Dalvian's words reverberated in his mind. The law, once an unbreakable bond between the Arbites and the Imperium, now felt like an unholy chain, a shackle that had bound them to a corrupt system, a system that had long since ceased to reflect the Emperor's vision of justice. The air grew heavier with each breath, thick with the weight of the realization that they were complicit in the very thing they had sworn to destroy. The Proctor Marshal's silhouette, sharp and defined beneath the pale light of the chapel's glow, loomed over him like a shadow. He had spoken the truth in a way that no one else dared, perhaps because no one else could afford to. The Arbites had been created to uphold the Emperor's will, to be the enforcers of law and order. But the law they had upheld was no longer pure. The Imperium, once a bastion of hope and righteousness, had become a machine of oppression, and the Arbites were the ones who kept it turning. Jacek's mind was a swirl of doubt. He could feel the weight of the Proctor Marshal's words sinking in, carving through the mental walls he had built up over the years. The system that had sustained him, that had given his life purpose, had become a tool for the powerful, a weapon wielded against the weak. He could no longer ignore it. The question he had been avoiding for so long now stood before him, clear and undeniable. What was the price of loyalty? "I was never meant to be a hero," Jacek said, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth. He had always believed in his duty, in the righteousness of the law. But now, for the first time, he questioned everything. "I always thought I was serving something greater than myself. But now..." He paused, trying to form the words that had been suffocating him. "Now, I'm not so sure." Dalvian didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the altar, his face hidden in shadow, as if he were contemplating the same thing. "We never were heroes, Jacek," he said softly. "Not in the way the Imperium thinks of heroes. We were the ones who kept the law, yes. But what happens when the law is no longer just?" Jacek's thoughts raced as he struggled to come to terms with what Dalvian was saying. They had been the ones to maintain the order, to be the iron fist of justice. But what was justice, really? The law had become nothing more than a mask for the corruption that ran deep within the Imperium. They were enforcers, yes, but they were also the ones who carried out the will of the corrupt, who upheld a system that crushed the innocent underfoot to protect the powerful. How long had they been blind to it? How long had they been complicit? "You don't have to continue this." Dalvian's voice broke through Jacek's reverie. "You don't have to carry the weight of this system any longer." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was an invitation, a warning, and a challenge all at once. Jacek's mind reeled with the possibilities. Could they walk away? Could they abandon the law they had spent their lives serving? The thought was both liberating and terrifying. The Proctor Marshal had made his decision. He had seen the truth, and now, like Jacek, was left with a choice: to continue serving the system, or to step away and face the consequences. Jacek took a slow, deliberate step forward, his helmet catching the soft glow of the candles around the chapel. "If I walk away," he said quietly, "what happens then? What happens to the Imperium?" Dalvian turned, his face unreadable in the dim light. "That's the question, isn't it?" he said, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Do you believe the Imperium will fall without us? Do you think the law will crumble if we refuse to uphold it?" Jacek's hand clenched at his side, the weight of his gauntlet pulling at his arm. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know this. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep serving something that's broken beyond repair." Dalvian's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Then you've already made your decision," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "The Arbites were never meant to be the ones who changed the system. We were always just the tools. The question is, what happens when the tools stop working?" The Proctor Marshal's words hung in the air, the final nail in the coffin of Jacek's beliefs. He had always believed that the Arbites were the last bastion of order in a galaxy teetering on the edge of chaos. But now, That belief felt hollow. The Arbites were not the saviors of the Imperium. They were its enforcers, and in doing so, they had become complicit in the very things they had sworn to stop. They were the ones who had kept the law standing, even when it was no longer just. Jacek looked down at his gauntlet, his fingers trembling as he unclasped the grip. The law had served him once, had given him purpose and direction. But now, it was just another shackle, another chain that bound him to a broken system. He had been a tool of the law. But now, he saw the truth. The law itself was the weapon. He turned away from the proctor marshal and stepped toward the chapel's exit. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. The Arbites were no longer the answer. And the Imperium, for all its grandeur, was a crumbling monument to its own corruption. Jacek walked out into the cold, harsh light of the city once more, the weight of his armor suddenly too heavy to bear. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. The law would no longer hold him. The city felt different now. The same streets that Jacek had walked 1,000 times before, where he had once enforced the Emperor's will with unwavering certainty, now seemed foreign to him, even hostile. The weight of his armor, the badge of the Arbites, felt like a relic of another life, a life he had abandoned the moment he walked out of the quiet chapel. He had been a tool of the Imperium for so long that now, free of it, he didn't know what to do with himself. The city stretched out before him, its towering spires and flickering neon lights like 1,000 eyes watching his every move. The chaos of the lower hive swirled around him, screams, the clatter of machines, the endless hum of power that kept the city alive. But there was no order here anymore. No law, just people fighting to survive, scraping by in a world that had long since turned its back on them. He had once believed that the Arbites were the only thing standing between these people and complete annihilation. Now, he wasn't so sure. Jacek moved through the streets, his mind a whirl of contradictions. He had left the Arbites, but he had not left the Imperium. He was still bound to it, still tied to the same system, even if he no longer believed in it. The thought of walking away completely, the thought of truly severing his ties to the Emperor's will, was terrifying. He had lived his entire life under the shadow of that will. He had given everything for it. What was he now without it? The answer, he realized, was nothing. He was nothing more than a man who had learned too late that the Emperor's justice was not the justice he had believed it to be. He had been a ghost in the system, a soldier of law whose very existence depended on the law itself. Without it, he was adrift. Jacek wandered through the lower city, the noise of the street vendors and beggars only adding to the suffocating sense of futility that gripped him. The faces of the people here were the same ones he had seen for years, broken, hollow, resigned to their fate. They didn't know him. They didn't know the Arbites. But they knew something was wrong. They knew the law wasn't working for them. It never had. And now, it never would. He stopped in front of a dilapidated building, its walls covered in grime and the marks of years of neglect. The lights flickered above, casting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the street. In the distance, the faint sound of gunfire echoed from a nearby sector, a reminder that, even in the depths of the city, violence never stopped. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, a decision he had made without fully understanding what it meant. Walking away had been the right choice. But where did it leave him? What was the point of leaving the Arbites, leaving the law, if nothing would change? As he stood there, lost in thought, a figure emerged from the darkness. A man, clad in ragged clothes and with a face that seemed to have been worn down by years of hardship. He looked up at Jacek with weary eyes, and for a moment their gazes locked in silent understanding. The man didn't speak, but there was something in his expression, a recognition of shared pain, a recognition of the world they both lived in. The man stepped forward, his voice rough. "You look like you've seen too much, like you've lost everything." Jacek didn't respond at first. There was nothing to say. The man was right. He had lost everything. But more than that, he had lost faith in the very thing he had once believed to be unshakable. The law, the Emperor's justice, the order of the Imperium. The man continued, his words cutting through the silence. "You don't belong here, do you? You've been a soldier, a servant of the law. But now you're just another man, walking through the wreckage." Jacek's eyes narrowed as he looked at the man, trying to understand. "I left the Arbites," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I left the law." The man gave a hollow laugh. "Did you? Or did the law leave you first?" Jacek's mind reeled at the words. The truth of it hit him like a blow to the chest. He had been cast aside. The Arbites, the law, the Emperor's will, they had all left him. He had never truly been a part of them. He had been a tool, a weapon. But now, without that purpose, without that duty, he was nothing. The man stepped closer, his expression a mixture of pity and something darker, something that seemed to speak of survival in a world that had long since lost its soul. "The law doesn't care about you. It never did. The law is just a way for the powerful to keep everyone else in line, and you were just one of the enforcers, one of the tools they used." Jacek's heart clenched as the truth settled in. He had been a ghost, a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. The law, the Imperium, it had all been a facade. He had been serving a broken system, a system that had used him and cast him aside when he no longer fit into its plans. For the first time in his life, Jacek understood what it meant to be truly free, and it terrified him. The man turned away, disappearing into the shadows from which he had emerged, leaving Jacek alone with his thoughts. The city continued to pulse around him, a living, breathing entity that didn't care about the choices he had made or the pain he carried. The Arbites were gone. The law was gone. And he was left, standing at the crossroads of his own existence, with no idea of where to go next. The ghosts of Terra, of the Imperium, would haunt him forever. They were the whispers of a broken system, a system that had once promised salvation, but had only delivered suffering. And now, Jacek was one of them, a ghost of a past he could never return to, a soldier without a cause. And yet, even in the face of all this, one thing remained, the undeniable truth that he had to move forward. The city was broken, but perhaps that was where the change began. Maybe the question wasn't what the Imperium had become, but what he, as an individual, could become. For the first time, he didn't have to be the law. For the first time, he could be free. And the ghosts of the past, however heavy, were not chains. They were the fire that forged the future. Jacek stood motionless in the alley, the distant hum of the hive city enveloping him like the heavy weight of a forgotten world. His armor, once a symbol of unyielding authority, now felt like a suit of empty promises, clinging to him like the past he could no longer escape. The words of the ragged man echoed in his mind, hollow and unrelenting. The law doesn't care about you. It never did. Those words, simple as they were, shattered the fragile sense of self he had clung to for so long. The Emperor's justice, the unbending law, the relentless pursuit of order, all of it had been a lie that he had spent his life serving. And yet, here he was, standing alone in a city that had no place for him, a man with no law, no duty, no purpose. He wasn't an Arbites officer anymore, but he wasn't free either. He was something in between, lost in the ruins of a system that had eaten itself alive, dragging him along in its wake. Jacek's heart felt heavy as the weight of the realization settled in. There was no going back. The Arbites had been his life, his reason for existence, but now that life was nothing more than a hollow echo, a part of him wanted to scream for the years of sacrifice, for the lost ideals, for the countless innocents he had failed to protect. But no sound escaped his lips. The city was too loud, its noise swallowing any trace of protest. The neon lights flickered above him, casting long shadows that seemed to mock his disillusionment. He had walked this path for so long, but now, with nothing but silence surrounding him, he was finally beginning to hear the truth. The city was a beast, devouring everything in its path, and the Imperium, its grand edifice of power and law, was the heart of that beast. The Arbites were nothing but its jaws, gnashing at the weak, crushing any hope of true justice. And he had been complicit. He had been a part of that machine. But now it was time to stop pretending. Jacek turned his back on the alley and began walking. There was no destination, no plan, just the need to move, to escape the weight of his past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Every step felt like a liberation, and yet, with each passing moment, the city seemed to grow more oppressive. He had abandoned the Arbites, but could he ever truly escape the shadows they had cast over him? The city was full of ghosts of men and women who had been crushed by the weight of the Imperium's laws, their lives sacrificed for a cause that had long since lost its meaning. And Jacek realized, with a sickening certainty, that he was one of those ghosts now. He had been a soldier, a weapon of the Emperor's will, but now he was nothing. The city had no use for him. The Imperium had no use for him. He was a forgotten soldier, a relic of a time when he believed in something greater than himself. And now, as the cold wind blew through the streets, Jacek wondered if he would ever find peace. His mind drifted to the faces of those he had seen over the years, the broken, the battered, the desperate. They had all fallen under the weight of the same system he had served, the same system he had once believed in. But now, he saw them for what they were, victims, just as much as the criminals he had once hunted. They were pawns in a game they could never win, trapped in the endless cycle of a corrupt Imperium. And yet, in their eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: defiance. It was faint, buried beneath the layers of suffering and fear, but it was there. The people of the Imperium weren't as broken as he had once thought. They still had something left. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the will to survive. Jacek stopped in the middle of the street, feeling the cold wind bite at his skin. He looked around at the faceless crowd, the people who were just like him, lost, broken, struggling to find meaning in a world that had stripped them of everything. And for the first time in his life, he realized that he wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one who had been betrayed by the system. He wasn't the only one who had seen the truth. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. One that didn't involve the law, the Emperor's will, or the Arbites. He was no longer a tool of the Imperium, no longer bound by the chains of duty. But that didn't mean he had to be lost. The law had failed, but there were still people who needed help, people who needed someone to fight for them. He had been a soldier of the law, but now he could be a soldier for something greater. Something that wasn't bound by corruption, something that fought for the people, not for the power that ruled over them. Jacek took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle in his chest. There would be no easy road ahead. The city would resist him. The Imperium would try to crush him. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had been a ghost for too long, a shadow of a system that had failed him and everyone else. But now, as the wind howled around him and the neon lights flickered above, Jacek knew what he had to do. He wasn't just a ghost, he was alive. And for the first time in his life, he had the freedom to choose his own path. The streets were filled with the noise of the city, but in that moment, Jacek was silent. He had no idea where this path would lead, but for the first time in years, he was walking it on his own terms. End.